What is up, slackers, and welcome to another episode of the Stuck in the Middle podcast. And whether you're joining me on the audio or video version of the podcast, thank you for taking the time to listen or view the podcast. Most importantly, as we kick off the show, please make sure you subscribe to the podcast. Now, each week when I'm trying to determine what my topic is going to be, it could be something that's happening in popular culture that just so happens to have a Gen X element to it. Last week I did Foo Fighters, which I felt was relevant. In this particular case, it's because the seasons are changing. Now, I have some friends who somehow go from summer straight to Christmas. No. There's plenty of stuff in between, and I'm sure that you know people like this who are just immediately right into Christmas mode. It's like there's nothing else in between. Now for me, and particularly my family growing up, Halloween was kind of an important holiday. And of course we have, Thanksgiving in there as well, so there's plenty of stuff that's going to happen between now and Christmas time. But I do know that once we get into September and the calendar changes and the kids are going back to school, all those spirit Halloween shops begin to open. And from my neck of the woods, Salem, Massachusetts, is starting to build to its peak, because obviously that's a destination during the holiday season, the Halloween season. So I was thinking about my own experiences with spooky things, and it got me thinking as I'm seeing some trailers for horror movies that are going to be coming out imminently. Again, horror movie season starts around Halloween as well. Now, you can have a horror movie any time of year, but certainly you get a slew of them once you get into the late summer, into the fall. So I was thinking about it from the perspective of when I was a kid. So one of the things we talk about often, or is at least maybe a trope of Gen X, the latchkey kids, the lack of supervision, the very different ideas about what is acceptable content. We're talking everything from movies that maybe were G-rated back then, that would certainly be PG, and PG that was PG-13, and PG-13 to R. Think of the Bad News Bears. That was ostensibly, marketed as a kids movie, and it's a bunch of foul-mouthed kids playing baseball. Different times. But horror movies and scary things were, they were mainstream back then too. So I know that there's been, at different points in history, kind of I guess you'd call it a backlash from time to time. Because as I go through the movies, that some of them start all the way back in, 1920s, 1930s. And I decided that I was going to limit it to my age of 10 years old, which would have been 1984. Now, the reason that I did that somewhat coincides with the fact that when people were concerned about media, it was protecting kids of a certain age. And I think of the number of things purely from either lack of supervision. I had very young parents who, they were less concerned about content, honestly. And sometimes it was just by happenstance or by accident. And certainly there are a couple of things on here that was certainly by accident. But there's a gradual evolution in any genre. You think about the Christopher Reeve Superman to where we are with, the MCU or the DCEU and the special effects, the CGI, the pure capability of filmmakers of what they can do. And really, I think in the areas of special effects, it's the horror movie masters, that were the ones that kind of pushed the limits of what you could do with practical effects. And some of them that became world famous, I think of, was it Tom Savini, working all the way back to the Romero stuff, to the present, truly. So some of these movies are not necessarily, or at least one or two, are not necessarily directly maybe considered horror. Maybe they fall more in the fantasy genre. And at least one of them, you're like, well, that's not a horror movie at all. However, if the first time you're seeing it, you're like 4, 5, 6, 7 years old, it certainly is viewed differently. Now, I don't know if it's because of the fact that I saw some of these, horror images when I was very little, that has made it so that I'm less of an aficionado of horror movies necessarily, but I do enjoy them from time to time. But there have been some movies that I've seen that I really didn't need to see. It's just I didn't really get into the early aughts and the whole torture porn thing. I do think that the original Saw is quite brilliant. I think it was really, really good. But then, I'm talking about the escalation of movies. Certainly for my late teens and in my early 20s, I was definitely watching what was at the time things that were envelope pushing in the field of horror. I think of a movie that I saw, and Carlos, you're out there listening, Necromantic. I mean, why does that movie exist? I don't know. We watched it. It was disturbing and bizarre. It certainly had its appeal, I suppose. But nevertheless, we're going to go through all of my scares from the time that I was little to the time that I was about 10 years old. So we're going to stop at 1984. Now, with anything else, all subjective. Some of you may agree, some of you may disagree. I do think there's a couple of them on here that enough people have said, yeah, when I was a kid, I saw that. Terrifying, absolutely terrifying. So let's get started. The Wizard of Oz. Now you might say, that is not a horror movie. Well, certainly Return to Oz is a horror movie, but that's not on the list. But when you're a little kid, and of course, it was broadcast every year, The Wicked Witch of the West and those flying monkeys, they were legitimately scary. Legitimately scary. And fast forward, my kids have grown up in an era of amazing CGI. But when my kids were little, we didn't think twice. We're like, no, it's The Wizard of Oz. But it wasn't until my youngest son where it hit me. Holy cow. Do you remember what it was like when you were that little? And the witch first comes on the screen? Or when she first sends the monkeys after Dorothy? It's really scary. And when you look at the series as a whole, I never went back and read, Fred Baum. I'm mangling the name. I should probably look it up so I have that information right in front of me. I want to say it's a couple of initials from the original books. But what I do know about the books, there are horror elements to it. It's pretty intense, and what they do to characters that are sentient. They're living, thinking, feeling, breathing creatures that are being put in terrible scenarios. Frank, oh boy. Let's see. Frank Baum. L. Frank Baum. Gosh, I was right there. I just couldn't get the whole thing all together. So, I'm going to put The Wicked Witch of the West on my list of childhood scares. If you agree, great. If not, hey, to each his own. I certainly know some people who let their kids watch much more intense kind of content, and the kids, I guess, are fine, but I guess we'll find out when they're older. 1960. Now again, before I was born, so both The Wicked Witch of the West and The Wizard of Oz, before I was born, the next two movies on the list came out before I was born, but I saw them at a young age. So this one is kind of by accident. So again, I mentioned earlier that some things would just be on TV at like random times of day. And you could turn on the TV on UHF, black and white TV, and you might see 1960s Psycho playing in the afternoon. So one of the places that I did have a fair amount of supervision was at my grandparents' house. So my grandparents were from the silent generation, World War II generation. So I was pretty well entertained when I was over there. But for whatever reason, they were watching something on the big TV and, out in the living room. And they had this little TV in their dining room. And I went in there and I turned it on. And I switched it to like either channel 38 or channel 60 something, 68, 67, and of course I come in when? I come in on the freaking shower scene. Now, it's brilliant. It's just as much about what you don't see as you do see on the screen. It didn't need truly the graphic nature of what you see in horror movies now, where you see each stab, right? You didn't need to do that. And that's what made Hitchcock really a master. And of course, brilliant performance by Anthony Perkins, Janet Leigh. But when you're little, and again, I don't know how old I was. At this point, I want to say 6 or 7. I think for a lot of this, around 6 or 7. And I stumbled upon it, and I'm like, what is this? And just the blood circling the drain, and, I burst into tears. My grandmother's like, oops, you don't want to watch Hitchcock. But completely one of the most brilliant films of all time. Now, one of the things that we get into with horror movies is how often, and there was an article that came out, I think this week, the diminishing returns of sequels. When you have a horror movie that hits and hits big, there's an immediate desire to go ahead and get the sequel out. But then you get to sequels 3, 4, 5, 6, 12. It's diminishing returns. But with box office being much more expensive nowadays, and you can, particularly if you're using a talented crew, using practical effects, still be relatively low budget. That means that your net income, like what you actually recoup and your profit, can be much higher if your horror movie does well. Which is why I think they keep making them. Low cost, usually open high at the box office. They make their money back, usually the first day. So good for them. But the latter Psychos are nowhere near the pieces of art that the original 1960 Psycho was. So kudos to Alfred Hitchcock. Now, the next one is legitimately scary for many. Excuse me. And so I mentioned my parents were young. So they were teenagers when I was born. And I would spend time between. I was usually with my mom during the week and would go over to my dad's on the weekend. My dad loved movie magic. And I think that many of us do. How did they do that? Oh, that's amazing. Did they do that with lighting or prosthetics or whatever it is? So he was always interested in that. I mentioned on the thrash metal episode that he was doing basic music videos for friends. So he was really into this creation that you can with video and film. So he would like to share what he thought were great films. It didn't matter what the genre was, which is terrible decision making from a parental standpoint, or brilliant, because I love movies, right? 1973's The Exorcist. Of course, directed by William Friedkin, who is also known for, The French Connection. I mean, come on. The French Connection? Are you kidding me? Amazing. Absolutely amazing. To Live and Die in L.A., which may be less well known, but certainly incredibly good filmmaking. So this guy is legit. At some point, I'll probably want to go and delve in a little bit into Gene Hackman at some point, because even though he's not from our generation, I think that he has been consistently in movies that have been a part of our lives. So we'll talk about that another time. But that's certainly a character that I think is somewhat underrated, particularly the original French Connection. So, Popeye Doyle, we'll get there. Starring Ellen Burstyn, Linda Blair, Jason Miller, Max von Sydow. You have legitimately talented, well-known actors in this absolute crazy, frightening movie. So as we go through the list, you have something right from the beginning. So The Wicked Witch of the West is fantastical, which is why it falls more probably in the fantasy realm than it does in horror per se. Alfred Hitchcock in Psycho, it's right there in the title. That's really a study of the human psyche and what it can be brought to. A fractured mind, Psycho. But here you have the occult. Not even the occult. You just have straight out demonic possession. So anyone who's been raised with any kind of faith, particularly Christian faith, I think is incredibly susceptible to these kind of images being disturbing and scary. And I don't even think people who necessarily were deeply religious people saw The Exorcist like, that's just legitimately scary. Because I think there's something in all of us. Again, it depends on your own personal views. I think many people, regardless of religious affiliation or even being non-religious, have some concept of the soul, or at least many people do. This, I think, hits on so many levels. And it's a child. Regan is a child. So my dad was into like the whole, hey, do you know how they did that? That's pea soup. Ha ha ha. Oh, do you know how they did that? Oh, they used the bed was on lifts. Like he's so fascinated by all of that stuff. And I'm just like having my mind melted watching this. Why are we watching this? Terrified. I remember exactly where his TV was in that particular apartment, and we watched The Exorcist. I might have been a little older at this point. I was probably 9 or 10. So still within this time frame that I'm talking about. But certainly, I don't think about when my kids were 9 or 10 going, hey, you know what we should watch? The Exorcist. Now, 1978. And this is no one's fault but my own. Because when you're told to go to bed, you should go to bed. And your parents, or in this case, my mom and her boyfriend, they don't need to tell me what they're watching. It's just time for bed. Go to bed. So this was on HBO at the time. Again, I'm like 6 or 7. Well, let's see. Actually, when I think about the timeline, because of my mom and that boyfriend, I was like 5. Like maybe even 4 or 5. So, tell me to go to bed, and we're at the boyfriend's mother's house. And it was kind of like a split level kind of thing. And there's a stairway that goes up, and little landing at the bottom. And on the other side of the stairway wall is the living room, where the TV is. And like right next to me is like the front door, and I sneak down the stairs because they're watching a movie. And I hear some weird noises. So of course I'm fascinated by this. Of course, I'm a little kid. Who wouldn't be? Oh, what's that? So I remember I sit down at the bottom, and they don't know that I'm there because they're into the movie. Because it's a thriller, and it's loud, and there's a lot of noise. And I'm watching. And I'm talking about 1978's Invasion of the Body Snatchers, directed by Phil Kaufman, who also directed The Right Stuff. So again, you have good filmmakers here. Donald Sutherland, Brooke Adams, Veronica Cartwright, who's in another rather famous horror movie. Jeff Goldblum, also a horror guy, people forget that. And finally, Leonard Nimoy. Fantastic cast. Terrifying premise. And this is the second of 3. So there was the original that was in the 1950s. Here we have this one in 1978. And then there was another one, I think in like 90, somewhere in 93, 94, 95, somewhere in that range. I haven't seen the latter one, and it's been years since I've seen the original. But of all the times that I could be down there, I'm down there where I showed my kids the clips the other night. Talk about differences in CGI and special effects. But little 4 or 5-year-old me sees a man's head on a dog's body, and the way that it's shot and the way the dog looks up, licks its lips, and I just shrieked and absolutely burst into tears. That was the scariest thing I could have possibly seen at that age. And I think part of it, I had been bitten by a dog in that same neighborhood, probably somewhere in that same year. So I also had a little bit of doggy danger at the same time. Oh my gosh. Weeping, sobbing. I wasn't getting to bed and they weren't seeing the end of that movie. It just wasn't going to happen. But the invasion of the body snatchers has stuck with me. And I think at some point, I may share some of these movies with my kids as they're older now. So my youngest is, as he puts it, I'm old enough to go see a rated R movie by myself in the movie theater. You know that, right? And I'm like, okay, I get it. So maybe gradually we'll get through some of these. But just the whole Donald Sutherland screaming, that shriek, it's an intense one. So, in 1979, this was a very, very popular miniseries, which meant that it was on later prime time, but 9 o'clock. And ever since I was little, I've always been kind of a night owl, have a hard time going to sleep early, just how it's always been. And I think part of that, again, having young parents who were up late, it was just, that's how it was. So either they just let me watch it because I was up, or I don't exactly remember, but all I know is that one of the most terrifying things, it caused a recurring nightmare for years. For years. I'm talking about Salem's Lot, based upon the Stephen King book, directed by a horror mastermind, a horror meister, a horror auteur in Tobe Hooper, who I think is, I can't say most well known for Texas Chainsaw Massacre, although that was his whole baby, start to finish. He's got another movie on the list, and it's not Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Master at work. And I'm talking about Vampire Children floating outside your window. So I saw this at my grandmother's house. And I had still do, but I have an aunt who's 10 years older than me. I mentioned her on the show. So with that age difference, she and I are closer in age than I am to my next sibling. So I didn't have a sibling until I was 16. So she would do the older sibling things, a little bit torturous stuff. And that included kind of feeding on my fear of this particular situation. I'm fairly certain that she went outside the window and knocked. I laugh about it, like looking back. I mean, if I was, 1979, so I was 5 in 1979. She would have been 15. You're too old for that. Knock it off. But I kind of laugh when I look back at it because that's the kind of stupid shit that I would do, frankly. So, Salem's Lot, vampires, vampire children on top of it all. I always had to have like the blinds drawn for years after that. Could not have an open window, couldn't have shears, needed to be solid light blocking. You close those up, there's no chance you're getting in. Kind of brilliant, like it's brilliant. Like all of it is. David Soul, I mean, it's just amazing. So if you are into vampires, and certainly vampires became such a huge phenomenon for like Gen X in particular, you think about some of the movies. Talk about Lost Boys, for example, and then series like Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Angel. And yeah, there's been a lot of good vampire movies, and I'm sure that I'm missing a few. But vampire series, shows, it certainly had a resurgence in the 90s. But Salem's Lot, it's just like like I said, it's a masterclass in horror. And the fact that it's in, serial form because it's a miniseries just makes it something I think kind of special. So speaking of kind of special, but in a very different way. But I think it is, Yeah, I think this might be right when I look at timelines here. So I'm just gonna fact check one thing here because I don't want to get this part wrong. Because if I'm remembering correctly, the next movie kind of introduced a concept. What I mean by concept is, okay, you could say that Anthony Perkins, because he got a franchise out of it. I'm forgetting the time in between episodes, but really, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre introduced us to Leatherface, who, got a series out of it. But the film series, so I'm not really talking about Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but the first one was in 1974. The second one wasn't until 1986. Probably wondering where I'm going with this. I need to see when this next movie I'm going to talk about got its first sequel. It's close. It's close. 1988 to 1986, but then someone else jumps in there. So, Texas Chainsaw Massacre introduces us to Leatherface. So he gets quite a few movies and still making them to this day. There's been video games. There's been everything. Just brilliant. But we get, in 1979, the Tall Man, played by Angus Scrimm in the movie Phantasm. Now, I don't know what scared me most. So, again, I saw this with my dad, one of his best friends, and his best friend was my age. So we are friends from being babies. I don't know if they took us to the movie theater or if it was like on Betamax or if it was on early VHS, but it was movie night when I was over at my dad's. I think at this point, this was probably 9 or 10 when I saw this for the first time. I don't know what's scariest, the Tall Man, the bladed ball that will find you, dwarf zombies that are made from the dead and shrunk down into dwarf size because they're going to be used for all manner of labor in another dimension. Who thinks of this kind of stuff? Don Coscarelli thinks of this stuff. A. Michael Baldwin is kind of the hero of the film franchise as Mike Pearson. He was not in the second one, by the way, which is a whole another story that we can get into. Maybe we'll dig into Phantasm another time. But yeah, the Tall Man became a recurring franchise. So the reason that I was trying to decide, okay, which came first, it all depends on when the sequel happens, because that's when they're cashing in and saying, hey, we need to get more of these out into the marketplace. So we'll talk about who usurped both Leatherface and the Tall Man and, Anthony Perkins' Psycho. Why am I drawing a blank on the character? Norman Bates. There it is. But next, I want to talk about weird tie-ins. So I mentioned at the start of the show that age groups, demographics, who things were being marketed to felt very different in the late 70s and the early 80s. And there is no greater example than I mentioned my friend, my dad's friend, so his son Christopher. We're both 1974. And he had a set of toys. He had a set of toys. They're, big plastic articulated figures. From 1979's horror sci-fi classic Alien, directed by Ridley Scott. Why are they marketing toys of xenomorphs to children? And that's exactly what it was. You had your Star Wars action figures, you could get your Aliens action figures. I remember going over his house and saying, what is this? Oh, it's a xenomorph. Because at that point I hadn't seen it. Well, now I'm looking at this stupid toy. Of course I want to see it. But again, talking about these great directors who are able to get either existing great actors or people who are on the rise. So I mentioned Veronica Cartwright, who is in Invasion of the Body Snatchers. So she's also an alien. With Tom Skerritt, Sigourney Weaver, Harry Dean Stanton, John Hurt, Ian Holm, and Yaphet Kotto. I mean, come on. They've all done amazing work. Everything from Oscar-worthy work to indies, to weirdos, to comedies, to thrillers, TV stars, Emmys. They've done it all. And they kind of all really burst. Haha, see what I did there? Burst from the original Alien. So I did ultimately end up seeing it, and yeah, it's really well done. The horror in space thing, I think that anyone who... So again, I'm not this deep horror aficionado, but I think Event Horizon, I mean, that's just it for your space horror. I mean, it overtakes Alien and Aliens. I mean, I think it does. That's just my opinion. Let me know if you agree, but Event Horizon, whew, yikes. Amazing, but terrifying in a deeply moving way. Aliens, because it has a combination of a real, threat, right? So you have these alien creatures, but then it's also, I guess, it's body horror too, because of what it does. It's just such an interesting genre. And I haven't seen some of the later sequels and the prequels. It's something I just haven't gotten to, but I'd really like to. So tell me what you think of that stuff as well. So here where I was talking about the character, the franchise character. And I think that the most glaring and obvious one, perhaps the one that is most well known worldwide, because of a very, very simple wardrobe. I'm talking about Jason Voorhees in Friday the 13th, and something as simple as a hockey mask. Amazing. But Jason, as you all know, and anyone who would be quizzed under duress, let's say like Drew Barrymore at the beginning of Scream. Friday the 13th, the killer is Mrs. Voorhees, of course. That's where Jason is even more interesting, because he doesn't show up fully. Like, obviously, you see him as a child in the original. But now, he's the main antagonist, or protagonist, depending on how you view that series. I mean, he was a child who was killed out of neglect, a child with special needs who is neglected by the camp counselors, right? I mean, that's a pretty straightforward, obvious, easy revenge tale that they tell. And then a camp counselor kills his mom. So Jason is this really interesting character who, with each successive episode, became more and more the star, and you rooted for him. Now, the reason I know this is because even as a kid, the next movie I'll mention, so I see the Friday the 13th Part 2, 1981, again, with my old man, because we weren't really watching any horror movies over in my mom's land, which is interesting because that certainly came later, and like my stepdad's into it, my sister's into it, but we weren't watching a ton of that genre at home. Not that I remember, at least not regularly. We definitely did later on with my stepdad. But saw that, and it's like Jason is this hulking presence. But as I mentioned before, the happenstance, the accidental viewing, just like Psycho, I'm at my grandparents' house. Normally supervision. I think they needed to go somewhere, and I was only there because either my mom or my dad needed me to go someplace. And my grandparents had something planned, so they left me home alone, which is not something that they typically did, but they also knew that I was regularly staying at home when I was at my regular house. Like, at my house, I was the latchkey kid. I came home and I was by myself. But they just didn't like to do that because they were old school parents. They didn't leave their kids unsupervised. Well, my grandmother was also, a stay-at-home wife and mother, so she was just always around. So this was an odd circumstance. So up in the second floor of their house, very, very modest colonial, and there were 2 rooms up there. One had been my dad's when he was there. The other was my aunt's when she was there. Well, there's a TV up there, and my grandparents were early adopters of cable. So it's all hooked up. And anyone who grew up with the USA Network might remember Commander USA. So think of a middle-aged, sarcastic version, like a middle-aged kind of, little stocky, just, I don't know how you describe him, but he couldn't be further from Elvira, right? Elvira was like this sexy goth lady introducing the horror movies. But Commander USA, he had, was it right ear, left ear, whatever it was, little hand drawn on, that's who he talked to. And he would introduce, usually, well, I guess it wasn't just horror movies. Sometimes it was just strange, offbeat, like imagine what would have been on Mystery Science 3000, something like that. Well, I'm very excited because the next movie they're about to play is Friday the 13th 3/3D. And I knew that somewhere at my grandparents' house there was a pair of 3D glasses that you got. Because if there was a 3D TV show, you can go and you'd get them in the newspaper or down at the local Wawa or 7-Eleven or whatever it was. Cumberland Farms in Connecticut at the time. So I'm looking all over the place trying to find it, but the movie starts. Now you can tell at certain points that it's clearly been filmed to be in 3D, but I am just fascinated. So at this point, let's see, that's 1982, right? So I'm 8 years old, but I'm starting to see I fully see the appeal. I fully see the appeal of Jason. I might have been a little bit older, because it's second or third run on cable. And you kind of find yourself rooting and wondering, what's he going to do next? So there was this dude, and I couldn't find his name, but I'm pretty sure that he was a soap opera actor. And I want to say he was Irish or Scottish or something. And I felt like he was a sheriff. I'd have to go back and watch it, because I've only seen it once or twice in total. And I remember it most acutely from that first viewing, because it was I was doing something I wasn't supposed to do. And this dude gets his head squeezed until his eyes pop at the screen. And I remember it happening and being oh my gosh, that's so amazing. I wish I could see it in 3D. So totally get the appeal of Jason and that entire film series. I'd mentioned the kind of movies that maybe others wouldn't think should be on the list, because they kind of straddle a line of fantasy, horror, anthology. Oh, I was just thinking about another one that I should have put on the list. That one with, no, I think that was after 1984. I will go back and look, because I might do an entire episode on that. It was an anthology, and you might know what I'm talking about. Let me just say, as a teaser for another episode, Emilio Estevez and video games. I think you know what I'm talking about. But I go to visit my dad. One of those times that I'm at his place. Again, a recurring theme, right? Recurring theme. And I guess all the Saturday morning cartoons were over. And I was probably being an obnoxious brat. And he was young. And I wanted to watch cartoons. Oh, you want to watch cartoons? Yeah. All right. So my dad, early adopter of VHS, he goes and he takes down a videotape. He goes, here you go. And he puts in 1981's animated cult classic, Heavy Metal. Some of you just went, your dad did what? Others have laughed, and others have gone, really? I've never seen it. So there were multiple segments of this. It was an anthology, and it is following this otherworldly orb. It has a particular name, like the Uru or something like that. So this has been Lochnar. Yes, that's it. It's the Lochnar. And the Lochnar is a recurring theme. So there isn't necessarily an overlap between the characters in the segment, but there is an overlap with the Lochnar. And there's one particular segment that is called Harry Canyon. So Harry Canyon. Now there is so much about this particular segment that I shouldn't have been seeing. I will just say that it was mildly pornographic, frankly, and ridiculously violent. But I was most struck because Harry's a cab driver. So, I mean, hey, spoilers from 1981, give me a break. I'm sorry, you've missed the boat. Go watch it if you're interested. So Harry drives a cab. This is in some kind of, not necessarily even dystopian future. It's just that he happens to be in kind of a rundown neighborhood or whatever it is. And, the name of the actor, the guy was in Mean Streets, but I can't for the life of me remember his name. I can look it up another time. But Harry's driving his cab, and it turns out he has this kind of magical beam, or not magical, maybe it's a science beam or whatever it is, that if a rider, a passenger, a fare decides to get a little uppity or maybe a little threatening, Harry has this little pedal and he pops open this little cover on it and he pushes his foot down and it basically disintegrates whoever's in the back seat. And that's how you open this episode. Is this kid, punk rocker, got the mohawk, takes out a blaster, puts it in his face and says, "Give me all your money." And Harry's like, "Are you sure you want to do that?" The guy's like, "Yeah," and he disintegrates them. So this comes into play later. So as he's driving away from there, it gets into that kind of hard-boiled, Philip Marlowe voiceover, and then this dame walked into my life. And a dame runs into his life because she is escaping the murder of her father. And she's carrying this case because this is, in fact, the Lochnar that has been at a museum. And these gangsters want it for themselves, magical properties, yada, yada. So Harry rescues her. He's like, I don't know why, but there's something about this dame. And they go back to his place because he is now going to protect her. He's going to keep her in his care. One thing leads to another. Next thing you know, cartoon sex happens. Now, I don't know if my dad went back to bed, if he went to go get breakfast, if he was nursing a hangover. I have no idea. But I'm just sitting here watching and kind of going, is he coming? Does he know I'm watching this right now? Apparently he did. But that's not what got me. So at that age, you kind of have these notions that, well, if people are having sex, then they're like, they're in love and like they're going to be to editorialize, you would like it to be for those purposes, right? Particularly when you're a little kid. Kind of a romantic vision of things. Still naive to the world. Well, this dame decides that she's going to double-cross Harry. And he's like, are you sure you want to do that? Well, we all know what's going to happen at that point. She doubles down. I'm not giving you a cent. You let me out of here or I'm going to blast you, kind of thing. And he pops open the little thing and presses down on that little button. And she's disintegrated. And he is like, I don't know, $100,000 or $150,000 richer. But that segment just blew my mind. It freaked me out. I'm like, how could he disintegrate her? Like they're supposed to run off and get married. And why is she ripping him off? Just It was for the most naive reasons. On top of all of these gnarly images that we're seeing of people getting disintegrated, and like what the Lochnar did to the gangster, by the way, is very similar. But not exactly necessarily a horror movie, but there were horrific themes interspersed throughout. This brings us to an absolute classic, and it's now Tobe Hooper up to bat yet again with 1982's Poltergeist. I don't even think I necessarily need to go too much into this, because if you are around my age, you know the power of this movie. Jo Beth Williams, Craig T. Nelson, Heather O'Rourke, Dominique Dunne, the last two, the young ladies, the two daughters, gone far too soon, and Dominique Dunne was only 22 years old and she was murdered by a stalker, and Heather O'Rourke unfortunately succumbed to what had been undiagnosed or newly diagnosed Crohn's disease. So when she passed away, I remember being hit really hard by it, in part because she was a child actor, she's around my age, and there was just something about like the concept of what happened to her physiologically when I read about it. Fast forward like 12 years later, I get diagnosed with Crohn's disease, and I'm like, oh my gosh, because just kind of remember being so moved by that. And then knowing what a hardcore disease that is. So, Heather O'Rourke, Dominique Dunne, just gone too soon. But Poltergeist in and of itself, this is where Tobe Hooper just pacing and like the set pieces, just all of it just builds and builds and builds. And of course you have Carol Ann and they're here. I mean, if that doesn't blow you away. And then you have the medium. I'm forgetting her name. It's been a minute since I've seen it. But, you know, you have this lady with this little voice who comes in and she's going to try to save everyone. But then she has a gravitas in her voice when there's all these entities swirling about. Poltergeist is brilliant. And I just have to give a little bit of a shout out to Poltergeist 2. So I was scared by Angus Scrimm as the tall man. I'm forgetting the name of the actor, but in the Poltergeist sequel, there was that, I guess he was like either an Amish gentleman or just an early colonial, and he's coming out of a cave, and there's just all this stuff, and he's standing outside the screen door. He's like, you're gonna die in there. Poltergeist series, and even the one in the skyscraper, Poltergeist 3, just mwah. And finally, the last one on my list. And this one reminds me purely of being a night owl and kind of an insomniac from a very young age. So I lived in an apartment where they converted, poorly, by the way, the attic into what they were trying to tell me, my mom and her boyfriend at the time, was it was like your own suite. No, it's a scary attic with like this weird room to the side that had this like ancient mirror from like the 1920s, and it was all dusty and there's spiders, and it was just a creepy room. Now, I tried to brighten it up and lighten it up with posters of Heather Thomas everywhere, because that was my huge crush at the time. But I had this little black and white TV that used to be our main TV, because we had a color TV late and cable relatively late. And I would stay up even as a kid. I mean, this is 84, so I'm 10. It was probably a year later when I saw it, maybe. So I'm probably pushing the limits of my own scenarios here. But it was definitely within the year that it was on TV. And it's on a black and white, and it's... Before I get into it, I would watch Letterman, for example. So I'd watch David Letterman. And then there was like the Late Late Show. And usually the major networks, well, all of them, all of the networks went off the air the same way. And that is with the Star Spangled Banner. The flag would start flying, they'd fly the flag, Star Spangled Banner, and it goes to, your tone, and then white noise. So that would be a recurring theme for me. Not every night, but many nights. My mom works late, so I would just be up, and then I'd hear her come in, or we'd say goodnight, or whatever. So one late night, probably on a weekend, a little movie called A Nightmare on Elm Street, directed, of course, by legendary horror director and just all-around good director, Wes Craven. So I already have a hard time sleeping, so let's go ahead and add a terrifying child killer who invades your dreams. I did not sleep very well for another year after that. Heather Langenkamp, also a major crush as Nancy. John Saxon, Ronnie Blakely, and of course the legendary Robert Englund as Freddy Krueger. And not to forget, the very first kill in the movie, if I'm remembering it correctly, because that's what I remember on that black and white TV, and imagine if I would have seen it in color, Johnny Depp making his film debut in Death by Waterbed. Such a groundbreaking series. The concept was so different, straddling the line between dream and being awake, what's real, what's not, and just the concept of having to stay awake to survive. And Robert Englund, he was the nice, nerdy alien on V. And here he is as the most sadistic, angry, violent, sarcastic killer in Freddy Krueger. So, I mean, you have your Mount Rushmore of horror movie villains. So I'm going to imagine that it's probably, just my opinion. Ooh, boy. Ooh, that's a tough one, because I'm second guessing myself already, and maybe this should be a whole nother episode. Yeah, this is going to be a whole nother episode. The Mount Rushmore of horror, because I have a couple of ideas, and I don't know which of these couple I might want to swap out here or there. It's a tough one. But if nothing else, I hope you've enjoyed this little walk down horror memory lane, this little walk down Elm Street, if you will. And maybe some of you can relate to seeing some of these movies maybe a little too young, or maybe that spurred on a lifelong love for the horror genre. For me, I'm definitely rather ambivalent. If I see one that really catches my eye, I'll watch it and thoroughly enjoy it. But it's not usually the first thing that I think of for film. However, every series that comes out that's like horror-based, I love it. One of my favorite things of the last probably 10 years, I really loved The House on Haunting Hill. I haven't watched Bly Manor, or they've just put out another one as well. But I thought that was really well done. Really enjoyed it. But then there's the psychological, the some of the cult stuff, and even some of the serial killer stuff. I mean, what would you call a movie like Seven? Is that a horror movie? Or just a crime procedural? What is it? Or does it kind of straddle those different areas? So I really like it when you can mix up these different genres. It's a lot of fun. So, probably for the next, month, between now and Halloween, there might be a couple of episodes that touch upon the macabre and horror movies, maybe some horror music, because there are some really interesting albums out there that would certainly fall, I think, within the horror genre. So, what are your favorite movie moments? Horror movie moments? What are your favorite movies? What are your favorite characters? What are the things that have stuck with you? Let me know in the comments. And if you're here on YouTube, please subscribe to the channel. I'd really appreciate it. You can also email me at stuckinthemiddlepod@yahoo.com. You can reach me on the Facebook page, Stuck in the Middle, a Gen X podcast. You can reach me on Instagram and Twitter at StuckPodX. Please leave 5-star reviews, like, comment, and most importantly, please subscribe to the channel. So, until next time, later, slackers.